are live. Good afternoon, everybody. Buongiorno. I hope you all had a nice lunch. I'm Sameer Padania, and I am moderating this panel about national and local funds for journalism around the world. And we have an frankly extraordinary and incredibly global panel with us. One person won't be joining us today. That's Francesca Bria, who was until recently the president of the National Innovation Fund in Italy. Unfortunately, she had to withdraw. But that gives even more time to these stellar panelists to share their wisdom and their insights with you about the funds that they're involved in and the work that they're doing. So before I introduce them, I'm going to just give a little bit of an intro to help you understand kind of what the phenomenon that we're talking about today is. We're talking about something that I think has started to emerge really in the last 3 or 4 years as a kind of global phenomenon, not just in sort of Western developed rich countries, but really in lots of different places around the world. A fund for journalism that is focused on sort of strategic and long-term objectives within a particular media ecosystem, and is rooted in it and rooted in its sort of conditions, and has a strategy to try and make that that ecosystem work better. They are emerging in places from Brazil, Philippines, Sierra Leone. We have one very small one, a local level one that we're trying to launch in the UK. There are ones all over the world. There are also, and they range from very, very, very small but structural to incredibly large and structural, like in the US, the sort of Press Forward initiative and things like that. So, these are phenomena that are beginning to become a tool for addressing structural issues, strategic issues within media ecosystems and journalism ecosystems around the world. And I think to scene set a little bit, why do, this is Anja Schifrin, so I will introduce her briefly. We wrote 2 conjoined papers last year. One which is about the broad international sweep of national funds for journalism. And Anja and Brigitte Alfter wrote a kind of counterpart paper which is specifically about government funds that involve governments and what are the safeguards and guardrails around those kinds of funds. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But to me, I think one of the interesting things that's been happening is, why are these funds now suddenly a tool that people are talking about more and more, from the very local level to the national and even international level? I think there are sort of 3 big trends, really. One, I think, is that people's patience has run out in different parts of the world and in different communities. I think, frankly, their patience around waiting for funding, waiting for different kind of solutions to come from outside to help them has run out, partly because of the inconsistency of that support and because of the fluctuations in philanthropic interests and various things like that. I think the second, and people want control, really, and they want input and they want to be able to shape their own environments. I think the second area is that sort of fluctuation in particularly global north funding. If you were in the private capital, Unlocking Private Capital panel earlier this morning, Heather Gilberts from CIMA talked about the frankly microscopic amount of ODA, overseas development assistance, that goes towards media, and how much of that microscopic amount, I think it's 0.3% of all ODA, goes to media assistance, and of that 0.3%, 90% is taken up by funding that's routed through international NGOs in the main, as far as I'm aware. So you've got really, maybe not. We've got Mira Milosevic. Tell us the figure exactly. It's tomorrow. Okay, we'll talk about that tomorrow. So you'll have to come back here, same time, same place tomorrow to find out. The suspense is killing us all. And then I think that there is a real sort of interlocking trend, which is about the desire for longer term outcomes. When you look at a lot of funding cycles, they're very short term. Forget about project funding, even core multi-year funding, which is still relatively rare, is for 2-3 years. If you're incredibly lucky and you get a Ford Build grant or something like that, you'll have 5 years. But it's really very short term. Funding cycles are short term, strategy cycles for funders are short term in a way, and having a fund at the national or local level allows you to plan for a much longer time frame, one that really responds to the conditions that you're in. So I think those are the sorts of, some of the key drivers that from my perspective when we did this paper really were the ones that people were feeding back to us. These are the motivations why this is happening. When you then put things when you put communities of whatever size, whatever type, at the heart of decision making and at the heart of designing and the heart of sort of the considerations of such a fund, that's what we're going to talk about now. I wanted to come to Anya Schifrin first. Anya is at SIPA at Columbia, but is also somebody who sort of supports and intervenes in lots of debates around the world, and I think is somebody who has a very, very deep and wide sort of understanding of the types of forces that are affecting the media ecosystem, particularly on the economic side. So it was maybe you want to start off, and then we'll come in a minute to Maya, and then to Robbie.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for coming. There's so many great panels this year. And it was really Mira Milosevic and the Global Forum for Media Development that took the initiative to publish our papers. And many other people were involved, like Marius Dragomir and my co-author, Brigitte Alfter, who really has decades of experience setting these funds up. And we're so organized that we even brought hard copies. So if anybody wants to read the report, you can pick it up afterwards. And I think what we were trying to do when we started sort of brainstorming, as Sameer says, we saw that there was all this interest around the world in setting up these kinds of funds, but we actually couldn't find very practical literature of how to do this and what to watch out for. So that's really the purpose of these papers. And we looked at funds all over the world and posed some philosophical as well as very practical points. And I think that, again, as Sameer says, I think that the funds obviously are not a solution for every problem that journalism is facing, but they can be sort of a relatively nimble tool. You know, getting a tax passed, getting a big government regulation passed. In my country, it's pretty much impossible, but setting up a sort of local fund or getting a few philanthropists or a local government, often where there's one congressman or one state senator who's sympathetic, can really start to work. And BBC Media Action has been working on this as well. So we found different examples. I think everybody in Europe knows the Dutch Journalism Fund, which is having their 25th anniversary and has done extraordinary work. But yeah, as you mentioned, you know, Argentina's had them, Sierra Leone's trying to set one up, Tanzania had one. Obviously the Scandinavians have, you know, lots and lots of best practices we can learn from. So we're sort of in a very pragmatic way encouraging people to think about this. I could talk more about the governance and structure, but maybe you wanted to wait for the second question to do that.
Yeah, I think we'll delve into the mechanics, and obviously I think many of you will have questions about those sorts of things, particularly around government funds.
Yeah,
and
I'll just say I've been amazed. I was in Iceland recently, and they said, well, you know, we've read this report, and now we want to set up a fund. So, and I just last week spoke to somebody from Uruguay who said, you know, I'm really thinking we need a fund, like, but I don't know what to do. And I was like, well, we've got information. So I think conferences like this are so important because this is where we all learn from each other and get new ideas. And you two are both talking about setting up funds, so. I don't know if you're introducing,
So before we come to Maya Fortress and Robbie Alampai, I'm going to just give a very quick one-line sort of definition. This was the working definition that we used, and then I sort of want you to, as your initial sort of thing, to sort of respond to that working definition. How does this play out in Brazil and in the Philippines? So the working definition we came up with for the fund, for a national journalism fund, National Fund for Journalism, is a dedicated structure that's designed with a strategic sectoral purpose to provide long-term funding and financing to an independent journalism ecosystem in a particular country, region, or place. So it's both funding and financing. You know, it's not just grants. It could be other forms of finance. It could be loan guarantees. It could be all sorts of different things. It's got a sectoral view, so it's not just looking at a particular kind of media. It's looking at a range of different kinds of media across the whole ecosystem and trying to look from national to local and so on and so forth. And also that its guiding principle is that it's in the public interest, which is why, these are being developed in the first place. So when you hear that sort of working definition that we, had a sort of year ago, can you talk a little bit about what Maya, who, and just introduce yourself with a description of Azure, but can you just explain to us a little bit about how in the Brazilian context that concept has started to unfold?
Yeah, definitely.
And then Robbie from Philippines perspective. Thank you.
I just want to thank Sameer because I think it's a great opportunity to share a bit of what we're doing in Brazil. I'm Maya. I'm Executive Director of Azure, which is a very young association that was founded in 2021 and is focused in representing digital media outlets in Brazil. We currently represent about 150 organizations, and I think the existence of Azure is already part of this process in which the media outlets and these young organizations that have been founded since 2000 mainly, for you guys to have an idea, our members, more than 50% of them have been founded since 2015, are understanding themselves as a market, as a niche of the market, and that they need an organization to represent their interests and a specific sector of the economy. And in this collective process, we understood that it was important to deal with these specific challenges and demands. And as I said, we represent many initiatives from many parts of the country. So it's a very vibrant moment in Brazil in which new organizations are being founded by journalists with public interest as a concept and as a focus. And also, I think we have had, one thing that also adds to this specific context is that we've had several political changes in Brazil over the last period, and we've come from a more defensive context in which we had a very authoritarian government which attacked constantly journalistic organizations, and we now are starting to, after a process of reconstruction, look at the ecosystem in a more propositive way. So we have been discussing ways to deal with two big problems our ecosystem has, and it's no news for everyone who's been in the event. One of them is sustainability, and the other one is access to technology, which is something that's common in the Global South, and I think it's important for us to discuss, which is how expensive it is, for example, to innovate in a country that has less access to technological human resources and tools. So this was mostly like the context in which we discussed the need of having a fund, and both these policy papers were an inspiration for our first concept note for the fund. So that was extremely important. It was extremely important for us to map what we had to deal with when we were starting to build the initiatives, so governance, transparency, and what type of grant, what type of organizations we wanted to support, what type of diversity policies we wanted to develop to guarantee that the money would reach organizations that currently have no access to support in Brazil. So, I mean, I think this is like a bigger picture. Do you think I
well, I think what we'll do then we'll come into the sort of mechanism of how the funds are actually being developed. But I think it's that, what is the context into which these funds are really being introduced? And so Robbie Alampai, who you're speaking in the context of your IMS work, international media support.
Yeah, thank you for prompting that. In my brief bio in the printed program, it refers to an organization that's not the hat that I'm wearing right now. In the online program, it does say more accurately, I'm here representing International Media Support. That's a media development organization based in Copenhagen. I advise on their Asia and Philippine program. And what we wanted to share here was our own attempt and interest to see the viability and actually develop a public journalism fund. Not at the national level, although that is the vision, but we are particularly going to start with a very small we hope, much more realistic experiment with literally the newest and therefore most fragile region in the Philippines. Just very briefly, we have incorporated and finally institutionalized, it's a mouthful, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region for Muslim Mindanao. It's just the final two words that really should be most resonant to you. This is an autonomous region for the Muslim minority in a traditionally and historically Catholic predominant country. There's no religious strife per se, but it just means that this being a minority and literally at the southern tip of the Philippines is the poorest and most marginalized region. And very quickly, it's safe to say that no media is viable there. IMS conducted a scan of media there, both the traditional media that used to exist and used to be dominant, as well as some efforts to do some journalism, notwithstanding all the disruption that all of us are aware with. But imagine the impact of what you feel in your organizations and in your countries in a region that is absolutely at its poorest. But hopefully, now that they are autonomous, also now presenting an opportunity for hope and building new models. In fact, the BARM, as we call it, will now undergo its first parliamentary elections, separate from the Philippine elections, at the end of 2025. So that's the context of the Public Journalism Fund that we would like to experiment with in this region. We hope for it to be small, but we hope for it to be harvestable for lessons and maybe even ambition on whether or not we can scale up whatever we learn by way of successes. Now, very quickly, just to your question, Public Journalism Fund, and maybe this could help to facilitate our conversations. Even as we are in the inception stage and consulting with the different stakeholders here, those three words immediately invite you into a thought exercise that we have been compelled into as well. Because when we consult, in particular, private sector, and trying to entice them, would you be interested in a public journalism fund? Interestingly, they have no question about the journalism, despite all their awareness of the sensitivities that might open up for them in a highly regulated and captured economy. They have no question about the journalism. Right? They are also, then their next question is, what's a fund? And what does it fund? Does it fund media institutions, for one? Does it try to keep organizations alive? Or does it fund journalism per se? To put it bluntly, what if we let media institutions suffer the market consequences and realities today, but can journalism somehow survive? And then the final question is, well, what's public? And the public goes to two questions, either the source of the funds or the mission of the funds. Right? Or it could be both. But in this case, we just want to clarify, our ambition here is to explore the possibility of the funding not being public, where we will explore the viability of raising funds from all sectors except government. Only because in the Philippines, if you touch public funds, that necessitates legislation. If we talk about legislation, that's a non-starter in anything. And so we concentrate on the purpose of the fund, and we default to what Sameer says, and I hand back to Sameer. Public interest is the purpose that then reassures people that, okay, we're ready to have this conversation.
Thank you. I mean, so then can you, I think that's a good moment to come back to, given what Robbie's sort of talked about in terms of the fears around public funding, maybe you could dive into some of the ways in which you unpicked that particular area of funding.
Yeah, I think that in a way you're describing a situation similar to many other parts of the world where there's so much skepticism about journalism and why on earth would we want to support it, which is why I think, for example, taxes to support journalism are pretty much a non-starter at this point. So I think, I'm at a policy school, as Sameer noted, and I think Robbie is making a really important point, which is even when you design a great policy or you have a wonderful wonderful idea, your first step is selling it. So that's what we talked about for the first couple of pages of this report is, first you have to figure out, it's like starting any business, what is it that what is the problem you're trying to address? What is the need? Are you looking at local news? Are you looking at investigative reporting? Are you looking at something else? And then building support is incredibly important. And I think we'll have a lot of interesting things to hear from the other panelists about how you do that. What we've often found in some places is that it's, one or two people with a passion who just work on it for years. I was at one of the early planning meetings for IFPIM, and that came to fruition. So, a handful of dedicated people really pushing and finding out ways to market it can really help as well. And then there's sort of philosophical questions. Do you expect your donors to ever become self-sufficient? Are you thinking about short-term funding or long-term funding, as Sameer pointed out? I think lots of people won't ever become self-sufficient, and I think it's important to be realistic about that. We also have in the report, Marius Dragomir wrote us a whole list of different kinds of funds, right? Because there are funds that support regions or entrepreneurship or emergency situations. And then part of persuading people to fund is to really take good care with the governance. And this is where my co-author, Brie Alfter, who's German but has lived in Denmark for years, was very, very helpful because she's had so much experience of how you build in governance. And so that's all kinds of things like arm's length lending, making sure there's an intermediary body that's not just, directly handing out. There's some kind of firewalls as well. Deciding on things like eligibility criteria, so who's going to actually get it. We're having a really interesting experiment in New York right now because the mayor's office is giving local news to community and ethnic-owned outlets. And at a conference where I was last year, some of the Europeans and Canadians were a little bit shocked because they felt that our governance structure wasn't actually as rigorous as theirs. So I think we can look to some of the Scandinavians for these kinds of rules. And I remember even Bridget telling me about one where the judges were secret, but every year they would reveal one name so that you didn't have total secrecy, but you also insulated them from being pressured. So I felt like Bridget, when we were writing this, had so many good ideas of how to avoid capture. And then I think my sort of final thought for this bit of the conversation is there's so much worry about future-proofing. And I think Robbie alluded to that. We've all seen, these terrible authoritarian governments come in, they start bashing journalism, and people are almost paralyzed. Like, we shouldn't do any legislation because we don't know later how it's going to get misused. And I guess my take on that, and I think it's really paralyzed the conversation in the US as well, and I think my sort of take on that is when you have really bad people coming in, like Trump, your laws and your procedures actually don't matter. I mean, it never occurred to us that we needed a law to say your kid shouldn't be in China raising money for your real estate fund while you're president. You know what I mean? We never thought we needed a law for that. So, so I do think that design is important, but I also think it's impossible to kind of future-proof for every circumstance because we are in a tricky place, the world right now. So, but I think we can't lose hope. We should still plunge ahead. So.
Yeah, you look at, lots of institutions are at the moment under attack that, were thought of as being future-proofed, independent governance, et cetera, and yet governments still find a way. So, including my own. Yeah. Thank you, Rishi. Can we talk a little bit more about the process of actually turning the fund into reality? So taking it from the concept into the kinds of actors you're having, the consultations and the conversations you're having, particularly around the financial model, and then also about this, question around governance and about, one of the things that we discussed before when we were just preparing was about in an ideal world, a fund is never a fixed entity. It's something that evolves in concert with the environment that it's supposed to be affecting. If it's affecting the environment, its priorities may then need to change over time. So how do you begin at the beginning of such a process start to think about these things?
Very carefully. And I do mean it. It's so easy to scare people off, And it's so easy to make people feel insecure if they feel like I don't think we're on the same page. Right? And there's so many things here. We'd like to think that when you talk about public interest journalism, we're all on the same page. Even corporations that might be afraid of political capture, we'd like to think that, deep down inside, we all want success for our country and so on. But, IMS, among other things, also advised and helped to develop a Philippine plan of action on the safety of journalists. Totally not on media development, purely on the media safety side. But that took more than 2 years of helping Philippine stakeholders consult each other and just to convene each other, because you won't be surprised how even on media safety, there are nuances that can really divide organizations and individuals. But we learned from that experience about a multi-stakeholder approach and really making sure that everybody's consulted. Now, fast forward, we consult, and I said, I'd like to invite you on this thought experiment because we've been running into this at every turn. When we do consult, and what I mean we have to do it very carefully, it has to be clear that you are, in fact, consulting, that you are not actually ahead of the game, that you're doing this perfunctorily when in reality you have an idea in mind. So the divergence, for example, on the question of the private sector or even philanthropical money or even foundations. Will you be funding journalism or are you funding media organizations? And on both sides, people will disagree on which is more ideal and which is more pragmatic. But there is real divergence there. And therefore, the first thing we did, learning from the multi-stakeholder approach, is to manage expectations. Even when we got funding from the EU to start convening for different stakeholders, we made sure that the outcome we promised is realistic and safe. We will pursue and explore the viability of multi-stakeholder interest to support, which is a very long way, as you know, in terms of results framework, from committing an actual fund. And it's also, to the stakeholders, a very long way from actually passing the hat. So the first thing we do is to manage expectations and to reassure everyone that we're on the same page. And then, once they're reassured, I've personally found it surprising how open they are then to more direct questions, like, how do I get your money? How do we get you to contribute? And from there, their next question is, I have no question about the journalism. I think I get it about the fund. That's not really my concern. One surprise for us is which is not a surprise given that Anya just mentioned it, their first question is really just on governance, especially the private sector. Their first question is, assuming we can agree on the purpose of this fund, how can you ensure that the money that I give you goes to what you say you will do? So it's just that. And that comes, of course, with skepticism on civil society, certainly on government. But just tell us, how do you propose to have an independent governance here that protects our money, but also protects you from us, right? And then from there, and we haven't even begun to answer that concretely, we're consulting everybody. And then from there, the next questions is, assuming we give money, how do we ensure that you deliver on your mission? How do we ensure, and how do you ensure that you protect your mission from our money? And therefore, the independent editorial management of this is going to be another separate conversation of this. And as Anya and Sameer's papers show, there are thousands of models for this, some of which have had unintended consequences, some of which have had success, and that's it. But that's where we start.
And so just to kind of, the stage that you've reached now, having entered those consultations, what's the stage of development of the fund at this point?
Well, where we are right now is we have gotten support to start the convenings.
Right.
and to more, in a more structured way, start consulting private sector, civil society, local church, local community leaders. We are consulting local governments as well, and even friends in government, but we are decidedly pursuing this with the idea that we are not asking for public funds. Not that we will never take it. I mean, speaking of never saying never to anything, but we have decided that this is the line of questioning and the line of logic that we're pursuing. So we are and even ahead of the convenings, we have started conversations and consultations with industry leaders, with private sector, civil society, MFC, Media Freedom Coalition, foreign missions, and certainly countries that have models for public interest journalism and public journalism funds. We've started consulting as well and trying to cultivate some technical support on how to move this forward.
All right, thanks. Maya, can you take us through a similar trajectory? Thank you.
Yeah, I think this debate, I mean, the first comprehension that we have had together, I think the first consensus to start developing this specific fund was understanding that, one, journalism has proved in Brazil that it's a pillar for democracy over the last few years, especially during COVID, where we didn't have access to data, and the press was responsible for developing access not only to data regarding the cases, but regarding vaccine and access to hygiene products. So I think this was an element that was really important. And also, it's an extremely unequal country in which, if you look specifically at the media sector, we had a long period of extreme concentration, and right now, organizations that have access to philanthropic money, for example, are extremely focused in the southeast of Brazil, mainly São Paulo and Rio. I wouldn't even say the whole southeast region. So we started understanding that we had to, in some way, and this was also something that the philanthropies had already discussed internally, that it was important to find a way to democratize the funds. And also one thing that we have been pointing out since the first day is that it's important that this fund has new money, not only the money that was already being financing specific organizations, because these organizations won't become autonomous in 24 hours or in a few months, but this has to be built. So we want to guarantee that this process also dialogues with what we already have in Brazil. So what we started was discussing models that we could deal with and understanding who we wanted to help, as Sameer said. We have this extremely new and vibrant new ecosystem, and Brazil has absolutely zero public policy focused in fomenting journalism. So the amount of money that is being invested is very small. And we started with a specific diagnosis that we are currently doing, which is a structured listening process to stakeholders from the field, and not only from the field, but also involving investors, companies, the government, other independent stakeholders. And also we are working on a framework to compare funding models raised to understand types of funding, governance, sectors, supportees, support model, and everything else. And we're also trying to produce more knowledge on the field, because we know a lot about what type of journalism is being done, but very little about the business models and the challenges faced in this media front, and not only the journalism front, as you guys were saying. So what we're doing right now is this diagnosis process. We already know that we want to give institutional grants. We already know that we want to have the most participatory governance model we are able to have, because when you deal with an extremely unequal ecosystem, you know that if you take money or if you give money, it will make a big difference on the end. So we want to guarantee that what we have as a governance model represents what the ecosystem has, which is a very complex system. Brazil is a continental country with several inequalities and completely different perspectives when you talk about the south or the north. So we want to also guarantee that this diversity is involved. We are still deciding the size of grants, but what we have decided is that we will have very strong diversity criteria, that we need transparency models, impact models, and this is what we are trying to develop right now. And I think that it's important, I didn't say before, but we are developing right now a pilot of the fund. So what we have been able to raise, only part of it will be used for the pilot, and the rest we're developing a investment plan to keep it and use it after 2 years, when we have already had this initial process of evaluation and impact evaluation, and just a dialogical process with the ecosystem to know that what we are doing is or is not the best model for our framework. What else? I think that that's it. Oh, I think that there are two important things that I hadn't said. One of them is that we think it's, as was said in the panel, in the first panel this today, it's a very small group of organizations that currently support journalism, and the organizations that are already supporting our fund are the only philanthropic initiatives that focus on journalism as a strategic field or a strategic track. Most organizations finance journalism due to the topics they deal with. So if you want to give more visibility to science, to the environment, you support journalism because of that. And we feel that the fund could be an extremely important tool to mobilize new funders for journalism in Brazil, and to dialogue with the Brazilian philanthropy that hasn't played an important role, but we think that can play an important role. And one thing also is just talking a bit about AJOR. We are an organization that represents several initiatives, and we understand that in this process, AJOR will have more of a consulting and articulation role, and not a role in like receiving the grant money and deciding who does not get the grant. It's an independent pilot, and it's for the entire ecosystem, not only for our members. So I think that's important to point out also, and that expresses a bit of what we are developing in Brazil, which is a group of organizations that works in a very collaborative and horizontal way, and doesn't try to continue working in a very, competing culture. We are trying to develop something that will develop the entire ecosystem. Can I say just one more thing about the fund?
Why
Sorry. We have thought about the grants will not, the institutional grants will not be just grants. We're thinking about having mentors and, I know AJP calls success partners, because we understand that it's very hard for an organization that has never received funding from philanthropic initiatives before to just receive the money and decide alone where the money has to be invested and how they will do any process of developing new products, for example. So the idea is to have these mentors that will accompany the organizations during these 2 years and help them do their own diagnosis.
This is, really interesting, and I know Sameer's eager for questions, but I also just wanted to respond to some of the points that you both made. So it's not just, sometimes it can be hard to receive money, but it can be hard to give money. So I know one program that ended up doing scholarships because they just couldn't, the person they thought could be the intermediary wasn't really able to disperse funds. So I think there is a lot of sort of flexibility that's required. And I think the sort of promise and the excitement is being able to not just unlock new money, but to be able to give it to people that haven't had money before. All donors say, oh, you know, we're sick of the donor darlings. It's always the same 5 people. But I would also say a note of caution, and I'm glad you're both being so thoughtful, which is journalism's in a terrible state right now. The business model is a mess. AI is going to make things worse. The last thing we want to do is fund a lot of things that have no hope of surviving. So, you know, I'm not saying everybody has to become the New York Times, and obviously the work I've done on global muckraking, you can have a lot of impact and only live for 10 years. But I'm glad you're being so thoughtful about that. And I thought that the panel this morning with Elizabeth Hansen-Shapiro and what the National Trust for Local News has done is, and also American Journalism Project, is raise money in different parts of the country. And then also so interesting hearing her talk about all the support that they give in terms of updating their business models and working. And I know at OSF we did that all the time. Algis is in the room of not just throwing out money at people, but then making sure that they can absorb it and use it for something that will keep them going. And then I think the final thing I just wanted to say before questions or whatever Sameer has planned for us is that really what's so interesting is these funds really do evolve. So some of them turn sour and are misused, and then somebody, you know, government decides to sort of improve them again. So I think your journey will be a very interesting one, and I hope that in a year and 2 years you're going to come back to Perugia and tell us what happened.
Hear, hear. I mean, part of what I think the funds that you are working on represent particular kinds of models. There are other models out there that I wanted to just very briefly name check. Yesterday I had a call with a team in Armenia who are developing a fund that they want to build on an endowment model. So, you know, what they're looking for effectively is to sort of bring in funds that will then build up a sort of principle of capital, which will then yield a yearly amount that will be, you know, in perpetuity effectively. They would hope, be able to give funds to the sector. You know, again, there are challenges with that. How do you find people who are going to actually be patient enough, you know, as the private capital panel we're talking about, you know, investors are patient enough to actually do that. You've also had things where it's not advisable necessarily to build one structure, but to align multiple structures. So, for example, in Indonesia, there's an emergency fund for journalism support and so on. That's actually a sort of school of fish, if you like, a whole load of smaller funds and bigger funds that are sort of aligned, but that have a lot of information sharing between them and so on. It does, you know, there are a number of different ways of approaching this that doesn't have to be, you know, put in a load of money into one fund and then give it away. You know, so, and in the papers there are some sort of further things, we won't sort of go deeply into that. I think one of the interesting things that I wanted to kind of ask particularly to the room, and I can see that there's the odd person in here I know who is actually involved in funds, is who's driving or who's funding, providing the capital for the funds that, you know, that are following a different model. So are there, I can see, you know, a couple of people, Joanna Kravchik, for example, if you feel like talking about the Ukrainian Media Fund, that might be an interesting example, which is more funded out of industry, the media industry itself, but there are others. I think, is there anyone else in the room, before we come to kind of more general questions, who's actually working on a fund, or has set one up, or has dealt with one? Yeah.
You need a microphone.
Can we go to Joanna first?
We are there already for 25 years. You mentioned the Dutch Foundation, it's 35 years.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. And we also give grants to individual journalists, to media outlets, project funding, but also from time to time core funding to media, small media outlets. So we have a diversity of income from all sorts of philanthropic organizations besides European Commission, Flemish government. So this was a strategy because we really want to be independent, not being dependent from one donor, but from several donors. We are still a small fund, but we have a budget of 5 million a year, so it's already something in Europe.
Okay.
It's open for everyone from the whole world, but it should be published also in Europe and should be relevant for the European public. We are not there to support media and journalists. We are there to make the information for the public better, more in depth. So this is our mission and target. We are not there for, for the journalists and the media.
Okay. Joanna, do you want to? And in the meantime, is there anyone else who's working on a fund or has been part? Yeah. Joanna.
Thank you, Sameer. Thank you. Yes, Ukrainian Media Fund is a 2-year-old fund that was established by organizations, media organizations interested in supporting our peers in Ukraine. And like initial push was from the Nordic countries, specifically media associations from Finland, Denmark, Norway and Sweden, who decided as industry in a given country to accumulate funds and then to transfer funds to a fund that would manage it. Since we are operating mainly with private money, we have little constraints when it comes to spending. So we are able to give out unrestricted funds which are spent mostly on salaries. Yes. Which is super important. I remember our discussion also with Sameer about this basic journalistic income, and I think that we are providing something of the sort for our Ukrainian colleagues. It doesn't mean that we do not go for public funding. We do it as well. But then the distribution of this type of grants, like big grants or bigger amounts of money from public bodies. Well, obviously, we are much more. This is restricted funding, and then we distribute it in a more project-based way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Are there other questions or? I mean, in the meantime, while we're waiting for the mic to reach. It has reached.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing good examples, but I would like to share some bad examples. When, like, for example, from Azerbaijan, and it's Azerbaijani government with lots of advisors of international stakeholders. 10 years ago, they established state support fund.
Could you hold the mic close to you?
Government established state support fund, and they put to the board some independent journalists, etc. But after they start to use this fund for buying like loyalty of the journalist community. And it's right now, after 10 years, they changed the name, they make rebranding, they make media development agency, and they're using this as like tools to destroy journalism completely. They are make a register for journalists, etc., etc. My question is, I think we are in advance, independent journalist community in Azerbaijan, we are laughing about these ideas, even some international stakeholders, even from OEC, they say, no, it's a very good idea when the state involved to such kind of things, but for us it's mission impossible when authoritarian states establish such kind of funds. It's impossible if you receive funds from your own government, you can expose them or do something for public interest. My question is, what is international donor community have response for such kind of countries? Because most of the countries decide to literally, and most of the donors leave countries like hopeless countries like Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. Therefore, why we need to invest via international funds to journalist community? It's impossible to do anything.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a different. I mean, in a sense, what the sorts of places we're talking about are places where there is enough civic space, enough financial space, enough democratic space to be able to establish some kind of space to do that. The model in more authoritarian or restrictive environments would be very, very different.
That's right.
And the risk of capture of those sorts of funds, as both all of us would know, and Brazil, I think would have 2 years ago maybe been in that exact situation. So yeah, I think that's a good point. I just on a related point, I just wanted to ask: is there anyone from IFPIM in the room? Khadija. Do you want to add anything? Because the International Fund for Public Interest Media has been doing has been working with and has actually funded
Yeah, it's
one of the Brazilian funds. I wonder whether you might have something to add. Can we get?
Thanks, Sameer. So we're working on a number of national funds around the world. Brazil, as well, the first national fund we worked on was, of course, in Sierra Leone. It's quite well documented, where basically, it was a whole of society approach. Government, civil society, media came together at a convening hosted by BBC Media Action to resolve the issue of a credible media in the country. And so the International Fund provided the initial seed funding for this initiative. However, the initial arrangement with the stakeholders, and particularly with the group convening with the MRCG, the Media Reform Coordinating Group in Sierra Leone, was that as a show of good faith, the government of Sierra Leone would also match what the International Fund was putting in. Now, for those of you who don't know, Sierra Leone is a tiny country that has been ravaged by war, and with a very small economy, no viable media market at all. And they have so far struggled, actually, to raise the capital to match the International Fund. So that's one of the pitfalls. In particularly smaller markets, when you're trying to leverage alternate capital as well. So that one there, it remains, kind of like a work in progress. We're trying to push other levers to make that fund happen. There's a lot of impatience right now from the media community for funds to start flowing out of this. As you can imagine, have been in the works for a while. But we're also working on, an initiative in South Africa, where there have been a couple of ideas for a national fund as well.
Thank you, Khadija. We've been asked, sorry to cut you off mid-flow, but we've been asked to bring it to a close. I think the answer there is that if you're interested in setting up an international fund, there are worse places to talk to than IFPIM. And I just want to thank everyone. Thank Robbie, thank Maya, thank Anya, and thank you all. I hope that was an instructive session. Thank you. Bye.